So in this video we're going to be talking about the Hebrews and how what happened to them in Iron Age Canaan had an immense impact not only on themselves but on practically everybody who came after them in the Mediterranean world and beyond. So during New Kingdom Egypt, during the Bronze Age, there was a large population of Semitic peoples that came into Egypt in search of a better life. Canaan itself was more or less impoverished, but it was also being fought over to a great extent between the Egyptians and the Hittites and the Assyrians, and so Canaan was not necessarily a great place to live. It was also, for a long period of time, largely under Egyptian significance, and so for Semitic peoples in Canaan, movement into Egypt itself was, in a sense, moving from one part of an empire to its more prosperous center, from, an outlying province. A number of different kinds of Semitic peoples migrated into Egypt and became the labor force, the underclass. For the Egyptians during the New Kingdom tended to sit back and let the laborers do things for them. The Egyptians were accustomed to being taken care of by the gods and by the Nile, and so the work ethic in Bronze Age Egyptians was not as instilled into their bones as it was in other peoples who had to work harder against the land. And so the Egyptians settled comfortably into having this increasingly large underclass of disenfranchised Semitic peoples that they used and exploited for labor. The status of whether you want to refer to them as slaves is, in a sense, less important than the fact that they were very important to the Egyptian economy, and yet were, mistreated, in terms of their standard of living, and unable to have a voice in their own affairs. And so, eventually, there was increasing danger of uprisings. And one of the successful uprisings was by the Hebrews, one particular nation of Semitic peoples that had settled in Egypt very late in the Bronze Age, somewhere around 1200, 1250 BCE. The Hebrews rise up and break free from their Egyptian overlords and seek to return to their own lands back in Canaan. This is what's referred to in the Egyptian sacred texts, their own writings about their own history and their relationship with God, as the Exodus. And so the Exodus leads the Hebrews into what they consider to be the Promised Land. Traditionally, this is under the leadership of a great leader named Moses, who is one of the first stages in unifying the Hebrews around a single identity. The thing about the Hebrews is that, like all Canaanites, they don't have a tradition of central focus, of central identity. The Semitic peoples in general tend to be locally grouped around tribes, and these tribes are often in rivalry with each other, even within ethnic nations like the Hebrews. And so the Hebrews that leave Egypt and attempt to return to Canaan consists of 12 tribes that are very loosely knit together, and it's very symbolic that the Old Testament stories tell us Moses does not live to see the Hebrews arrive in the Promised Land, because this underlines the fact of how divided the Hebrews are when they get there. So, brief overview of Hebrew history. The Exodus occurs sometime in the 13th century. When they get into the Canaan, they find it already occupied by other Semitic peoples, and by the Philistines, the Indo-European outsiders, who are hostile to everyone, who have control of iron, and so have great weapons and a high standard of living, and so are isolated and hated as foreigners and interlopers by all the peoples of Canaan, the Hebrews included. And so the Hebrews have no place to go. They have to settle in the wastelands between the cities of the Canaanites. Including the coastal cities of the Phoenicians, and also the inland cities that belong to the Canaanites, that are very well fortified against the Egyptians and the Philistines and everyone else. Places that become famous later, like Jericho and Jerusalem. And so during this period, the Hebrews are divided. They're fighting against each other. They more importantly, they don't work together, because they don't. Their need to establish land for themselves and homes for their people is associated with their tribe, and so each of these 12 tribes is trying to carve out land for themselves rather than working together. So this is the first roadblock. The first problem that the Hebrews have coming into Canaan is that they are divided. Socially and politically. Each tribe is led by a tribal leader called a judge. And so the war with the Canaanites and the Philistines takes a very long time, goes very, very badly at first, because each of these tribes is fighting alone or in temporary alliances with 2 or 3 other tribes in order to make limited amounts of headway. The second problem that the Hebrews have coming into Canaan is that, they are poor, they are refugees from Egypt, and the Philistines and the Canaanites, especially the Phoenicians, are very wealthy. And so especially the young among the Hebrews are finding the life of the Canaanites in their cities to be alluring. Why should they live through all this suffering, out in the camps in the wilderness, when if they leave and go into the Canaanite cities or even the Philistine cities, they'll find wealth and prosperity and sex and sensual pleasures. The great danger that the Hebrews are from is not just the danger of attack by death at the hands of a Canaanite or Philistine sword, but the loss of their future by immigration of assimilation of Hebrews into the Canaanites, and particularly has a religious aspect, because the Canaanites celebrate very body and carnal festivals that involve a lot of wine, a lot of carnal elements in festivals to a particular Canaanite god known as Baal. And so, as a result, the Hebrews are in great danger of falling apart, in all possible ways, because they're divided, because they don't have a central identity. And so, the necessity comes that they have to force a centralization on themselves. And this means overcoming the two dividing problems at once. They have to create a central a political identity and a central cultural identity and a central religious identity in order to hold themselves together and not disintegrate. And so this means creating a king for the first time, and it means creating a unified religion that focuses on not the way that religion normally works, which is associated with the natural environment. The natural environment, the gods of Canaan belong to the Canaanites, and so are hostile to the Hebrews. The Hebrews need a religion of their own that focuses on them as a people, rather than the typical pagan gods that are associated with the land and with places. And so this is the origin of what we now call Judaism. And so as a result, the Hebrews were able to establish a much stronger identity, and this makes them stronger politically. It makes them stronger militarily. They're able to carve out a kingdom for themselves, which eventually conquers most of the Canaanites, and isolates and reduces the power of the Philistines as well. Eventually eliminating the Philistines as a power altogether. And this happens, relatively rapidly once they centralize under the three great kings of the Hebrews, Saul, David, and Solomon. After Solomon, the Hebrews divide into two separate kingdoms that are in conflict with each other. This weakens the Hebrews overall, and this is simultaneous with the rise, once again, of great empires surrounding Canaan. The combination of those two things means that the Hebrews become vulnerable, and first the northern kingdom of Israel is deported, and then the southern kingdom a century and a half later. But at the height, the kingdom of Israel is immensely powerful. The accomplishments of the Israelites, of the Hebrews, is intense. They create great cities of wide renown. The rulers of the Israelites are respected and feared by the surrounding territories, and the main reason that the Phoenicians remain is that the Israelites see the benefits of this great trading nation. As long as it is not a military threat to them, the traders of the Phoenicians engaging with the Israelites only will serve to enrich both parties. And in fact, the great Temple of Solomon, which becomes the holiest place of the Hebrews in Jerusalem, Solomon calls in Phoenician architects and masons and marble and stone in order to make it the most magnificent edifice in all of the ancient world. But once after Solomon, the kingdom falls apart into two hostile pieces. This makes them susceptible to the Neo-Assyrian Empire that rises up in the 8th century, and the Assyrians have this technique of their drive is to oppress and reduce and crush the identity of all the peoples that they rule over. One of the means by which they do that is to deport dangerous populations rather than leaving them to be there as a potential focus of rebellion in territories that they conquer. They rip peoples that they conquer out of their homeland and send them off someplace else. And this is what happens to the northern kingdom of Israel. Israel, a large proportion of the population is ripped away from their homeland in Israel and sent to settle in Assyria, and these populations are dispersed, and what the Hebrews refer to as the northern tribes are lost. They assimilate into the Mesopotamian peoples and become lost as Hebrews, and they vanish into history. And so when the time comes and the southern kingdom, Judah, becomes conquered and deported in their turn by the Chaldean Babylonians in the 6th century. They have the example of the Israelites. The Israelites are gone. Not only are the Israelites gone and vanished, but the Assyrians had settled colonists in Israel that became, these were hated foreigners, that were non-Hebrews, that were hated by the remaining Hebrews, and these are what's known as the Sumerians, and so this is or Samaritans. The land became known as Samaria, and the people that were resettled there by the Assyrian overlords were the Samaritans. And this is why, Jesus in the New Testament tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, the fact that the parable, the key to this parable that's lost on many people that hear it, is that the Samaritan was a hated foreigner who nonetheless was kind when these other Jews passing by the wounded man were not. But when the time came for Judah to be conquered and deported in the 6th century, they had the example of the Israelites who were lost and vanished, and they were obsessed with the idea of ensuring that this did not happen to them. They dedicated themselves absolutely to retaining their identity as Hebrews. And so during the captivity in Babylon, which lasts for the better part of the 6th century, all of these Hebrews, the peoples of Judah, and so we refer to them as Jews. All of these Jews living in Babylon forced themselves to retain a Jewish identity, and they do this by creating these rigid rules that set them apart from all the peoples that they live among. The rules of their religion, rules of ritual, rules of things like circumcision, things like things that it is forbidden for them to eat, rules about marriage and every other practice of private and public life in an effort to ensure that they remain separate, that the Jewish people are not lost, and as a result, the Jews forged themselves into the Jewish people as we now think of them, separate and bound together by their identity as Jews and by their unique relationship with their God. We see at the beginning of Hebrew history that that part of the key to creating a Hebrew identity is a God that belongs not to the physical landscape, not to a place, but to a nation. And this becomes even more important when the Jews are exiled. Normally, with paganism, if you leave a place, and go into another place, you leave behind the gods of the first place and become subject to the gods of the second place. And so this would have meant for the Hebrews, first when they're coming into Canaan, that they were subject to the gods of the Canaanites. And later, when they were exiled to Babylon, that they would have left their gods behind. So instead, the Hebrews during the Kingdom of Israel focus on having a national God that belongs to them, that is connected to them in their hearts as Hebrews, and this becomes crucial to their survival once they are exiled to Babylon. That there is one God that belongs to the Jews, and that all other gods are false. This is the other thing about paganism, is that you have to assume that, if you leave the domain of one God and go to the domain of another God, that, all of these gods are perfectly valid and, belong to whatever place they are connected to, and whatever, natural phenomena they are bound to. And so, there's an assumption that, the gods of, if you're Egyptian, that your gods pertain to you, your land as Egyptians, and if you're a Canaanite, that your gods pertain to your land as in Canaan. And so, other gods are gods of other people. With Judaism, we have the innovation that this is a God that is the only true God, and all other gods like Baal are false gods that are there to corrupt and pull away, from the true God. And so, as a result, monotheism has this unique capacity to bind together a nation of people through their relationship with God, that is based on not on a God happening to belong to a particular place, but on a God having chosen a people and a people having chosen a God, and there being a covenant, a binding relationship of mutual of mutual loyalty between this God, the God of the Jews, Yahweh, and the Jewish people. And so as a result, monotheism in many ways makes the Jews much stronger culturally and socially than any other pagan people in the ancient world. And the Jews are feared by the empires that encounter them. The monotheism of the Jews becomes a thing that makes the Jews unabsorbable, and even in some ways unconquerable. This is the fear of the Jews is something that we see beginning from the time of the Persians, and it becomes a driving factor in the Roman relationship with the Middle East, and carries down all the way down to the 20th century and the attempted genocide of the Jews by the Nazis. The fear of the strength that the Jews have in their unique relationship with their God, and the way in which it binds them together as a people, is a revolution in religion. Nothing like this had ever happened before, and it fundamentally changes the social landscape of the ancient world. So just to summarize, the forms of ancient religion that we have to deal with in the ancient world, most everything is pagan and polytheistic, having a wide array of gods that are each associated with a natural phenomenon of a particular place. And so in Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, all the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the Anatolians, the Minoans and the Greeks and the Aegean, all of these people are polytheistic. The Persians develop something called dualism, in which there is a force for good and a force for evil, and those two forces are balanced. The God of light and order is balanced against the God of darkness and chaos. In Persian Zoroastrianism, this is Ahura Mazda is the god of light, and Ahriman is the god of darkness. And dualism presents its people with a choice. Either you choose good and light and order, or you choose darkness and chaos and become an enemy of society and an enemy of the state. And then the Jewish innovation is monotheism. They develop this unique relationship with their own national God. And this is carried forward and reinvented by the Christians, and later on in the Middle Ages, this in turn is passed on to Islam. Islam is directly descended from from Judaism and Christianity. The fundamental idea is that each person has a relationship with God, a personal relationship with God that is based on mutual covenant, mutual loyalty, and this is an absolute game changer for how the ancient world works. And the advent of Judaism and then the spread of Christianity changes everything. And that's that.